What can we do to prevent corruption?
Yeah, everyone that we've helped fix corruption for, I wish they had a time machine where you go back and cover this section 2 years or 5 years before they got hit with corruption. So really, there's really no way to completely prevent corruption. There's always some risk of it happening there. But the goals are really to reduce the likelihood of corruption being hit and increase the chance of survival. So for instance, the example of the computer running under someone's desk that was impacted by a lightning storm. Well, that could reduce the likelihood simply by having a good battery backup or even a good offsite backup of the data file on a regular basis. But with everything, the whole goal is how do we reduce the likelihood and increase the chance of survival, because there's always a chance it's going to happen.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is, and it's one of those increase the chance of survival, is regular check DB. As often as possible. I would like to say as long as your storage can do it, once a day, minimum of once a day, sometimes more often than that, but at least once a day,
Yep.
With the exception of some huge databases.
Yep. And I've heard the example of people have tried to explain that their database is so big and it is so important to the business to be online and not bogged down at all that they can't afford to run CheckDB on it. Well, that may be a scenario that you want to make a backup and run CheckDB on another server occasionally, but the fact that it's so important you can't do without it, that's all the reason to be running CheckDB more often.
Yeah, for sure. There's a few clients that we work with that have, databases in the like 2 terabyte range, and their storage is so slow it takes, 14 hours to run a check DB. That's an example. And fortunately, the customer I'm thinking of, they've already signed to buy new storage. That's an example of you need faster hardware.
Yep. And I think with that, if you can't possibly do it every day, well, if you could do half of them every day and half of them every other day and alternate days, that's one way to do it too. It's not as good as every day, but it's maybe good enough based off of that environment. And there's even some that I run CheckDB 3 or 4 times a day on some clients because it's important data and they're small databases, and I want to know about it as soon as it happens so we have more options to recover and to recover quickly. Now, the other key thing with CheckDB is to make sure that you're doing alerting on the CheckDB failures. I don't know how many times we've talked to people and they said, oh yeah, I've got my CheckDB job running, and we look and yep, it's been running for months, and yep, it's been corrupt for months, and nobody's looked at the success or failure of the job, and nobody's has any notifications. So it could sit there for years and be corrupt, and they wouldn't know about it. So it's really important to get email and or text notification on this, because even if it's on a weekend and you can find out about it on a Saturday and know about it and be able to get it fixed over the weekend, that's a much better situation than having to deal with it Monday morning when everybody's screaming about it.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, the next thing on there is immediate response. That we put those two things on there. React as your job depends on it, and it could be a resume generating event. And we don't mean that as, oh, there was corruption, you're going to get fired because there was corruption. We mean that is there's certainly clients that we've repaired corruption for that have told us they would have gone out of business had we not been able to repair their corruption.
Yep.
So it may be that everybody in the company is losing their jobs if you don't respond to it quick enough.
Absolutely. So some of the alerting that we want to do besides just the failed CheckDB is on other errors in SQL Server. And you can set up alerting in the SQL Server agent for errors 823, 824, and 825. And these are usually really serious errors. And a lot of the times when we've had customers call us with corruption, we've looked back and seen that these errors have shown up in their error logs a couple of days or even more before they got hit with the real problems. And these are usually an indication that something is starting to go really bad with the communication with disk.
Yeah, and then beyond those, there's some other severity 20 through 25 alerts, or if you go 19 to 25 is what we typically monitor. There's a couple false positives in there that happen, and false positive meaning like, yes, the alert or the error happened, but it may not be anything to worry about. But I'd much rather get notified on the stuff that I need to know about right away and have, one or two kind of false positives in there than not know about it.
Yep. And the big key to success at this is to be able to respond immediately when you see these alerts. And it's one of those things that literally, if you start seeing them on a Friday night and you say, I'll deal with them on Monday morning when I get back in the office, well, that database may be gone by Monday morning. So, and the options you have to recover it may be lesser at that point as well. So get on it as soon as you can when you see these kind of problems.
All right. The next thing is update. And, the old system administrator thing is don't fix what isn't broken. But, and the unfortunate thing of today is, especially with security holes, and those security holes leading to getting your data ransomware, updates are important. And, we shared with you two examples of two clients that probably could have avoided corruption completely had their firmware on their iSCSI switches been up to date. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be on the bleeding edge and updating things the day it comes out, but it does mean that you need to be, get on those notifications. A lot of vendors have notifications where they'll email you when updates come out. And some of the really good vendors, they not only email you, but you can read through it right on the email and decide, is this something I need to do now, soon, or I can wait till the next one? And so, do those firmware upgrades. Your storage, servers, networking, all of the above. Windows updates, the same. Keep Windows up to date. That especially helps with ransomware, and SQL Server updates too. There is at least one specific SQL Server version that Steve and I will almost refuse to touch unless it's upgraded from that version.
Oh, you mean 10.5.2500?
10.5.2500.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we ever see that one, then we really get shivers up our spine. And that's because that version of 2008 is known to have stability issues.
Yep. So, Derek, if the client or the management team doesn't want to do updates because they don't want to have the hassle of downtime, and they say, well, we'll do updates once a year, how would you respond, or how would you deal with that?
So, it's one of two things. It's actually a few different things. The first thing I would tell them is that not only ups your risk of security and not getting those updates, that also ups your risk of when you go do the updates, are you going to have a problem because you were so far back? And a lot of times it's not once a year, it's many years.
Right.
And you're so far back, you're jumping so many versions, you may have a problem. And then it's like, well, what version caused the problem?
Oh, yeah.
So that's one thing. Another thing is then that makes that downtime window much longer. And the client already doesn't like downtime, and you're telling them you need a many hour downtime instead of a short downtime. I really try to push back. I like to do updates once a month. It seems to be a good cut between, like every 2 weeks is too much. It's too wearing on staff. Updates once a month seems to work out well, unless there's a really urgent one. And, sometimes slipping to, once every other month or once a quarter,
Yep.
depending on the client's needs.
And, with that, one thing that actually scares me more to be doing than fixing corruption is applying updates on a SQL server that hasn't had any Windows or SQL updates in 4 or 5 years, or maybe has never been rebooted in that time, because you don't know that it's necessarily going to come back when you apply those updates, and that always scares me. So
yeah, it's funny. We always used to say like, oh man, that system's been on for a year. Like, look how stable it is.
Yeah.
And now that's more like, is it going to reboot when you reboot it?
Exactly.
And I've certainly seen that in the working world. There was one time it's not through Stedman Solutions, but we took over IT services at this medical clinic, and they had servers that had been up for many years. Especially with Windows, you were at that point where, will it boot up? Is everybody's worry.
All right. Other ways to reduce impact are backups, good backups, frequent backups, and offsite backups. With that, it's not just SQL backups, but also virtual machine and system backups. Not just backups, but backups that have been confirmed and tested recently. There's one system I work with where we've got all the backups go off to one server, and then that server runs and does a random restore of those backups, and then does a check DB after it does the random restore of those and confirms that things are good. And if it ever runs into an issue, it alerts, and it even applies transaction logs when it's doing that. So that's an example of knowing the backups work, because it's going to alert us if the backups are broken somehow.
Yeah, and that's another good point. There's a lot of software that will do that for you. I know Veeam will do that for you these days. The other thing I want to drive home is, have different types of backups. Just because you have Veeam or Zerto or some other backup product or Commvault backing up your virtual machine, don't think that that's good enough for your business case. Really explore it. In most instances, you want those virtual machine backups and you want SQL Server backups separate on top of that. And that gives you options.
Yep.
And options is what you need anytime you experience, any kind of system outage, corruption or not.
So an example of that would be if you just had like a daily full virtual machine backup, and then you had SQL Server transaction log backups. If your full backups were happening at like 11 p.m., but you had corruption at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if all you had was the full virtual machine backup, that 11 p.m. might be your only option to recover. But with those transaction log backups, you could do a recovery to that 11 p.m. point, and then do the SQL full backup, and then replay the transaction logs up to moments before the corruption was introduced. And that may make the difference between losing a half a day's worth of business or not. Now, the importance of that may vary depending on how important your data is, but most people consider their data pretty important.
Yeah, and part of that testing goes along with, I'll mention it real quick, is, make sure that your backup systems aren't fighting each other. And one of those is if you're doing separate SQL backups with log backups, you want to make sure that your VM level backups are set to do a copy only and not truncate the transaction logs. Or you may very well feel like you're getting great backups, and you got to restore them and realize that your transaction log has been stomped on, as Steve calls it, and there is no restoring except to the full.
Yep. So virtualization and storage. I mean, a lot of the times as a DBA, you're thinking just about the SQL Server, but a lot of other factors go into this. And I know, Derek, this is kind of your specialty, not mine. So.
Oh, yeah. So, we already talked about having notifications set up in SQL Server. Get those notifications set up on all your systems. Get them set up on your storage. Get them set up on your virtualization level. Get them set up inside of Windows. Most of the server vendors out there, they're not only are they have notifications if you set them up right, where they notify you. If you're under warranty support, they notify the vendor. And there's one vendor in particular that I'm thinking about. I had a hard drive failure a few months ago, and drive failed in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. Ray automatically took action, used the hot spare, rebuilt the RAID, so there was no data loss, and kicked me an email. So I woke up to the email, and then I, even better, woke up to another email from the vendor saying, "Hey, your Array home phone, bad hard drive. Where do you want us to send the replacement drive? And we'll get it to you within 4 hours."
That's so much nicer than waking up to just your drive being gone and data missing.
Yeah, data missing. So get those. And the other thing is, there's a lot of, especially at larger companies, where maybe the systems administrator and the DBAs are separate. So you may not have insight into those systems. So, go take that system administrator out to lunch, become friends with them, make sure that they have insight into those systems. And especially most of the customers I work with, the data is so important. They can't afford not to have hardware and software support warranties on their system. So, there's use cases that maybe you don't need the warranty because you have enough redundancy built in and you have other options. But if you're relying on that system to keep the doors open in your business and you go out of business if it goes down, have good warranties on that. Yep. And have support so you can call them when you are having a problem with that storage array or that server.
And if you're working with your management team or your finance or your budgeting team about paying for that support, you can use some of the examples from our presentation here as maybe case points to prove how important it is to have that.